Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The mystery of China. A lot of people fail to understand what's happening in China was probably written 100 years ago. What they're doing as far as their plan for their country is concerned is part of a whole history of China. If we understand that, we probably understand what the moves that the Chinese are going to make. To take this very, very interesting and very, very important subject up, I have with me Dr. Geeta Kochhar, who is the Senior Assistant Professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies at the JNU. Firstly, ma'am, thank you so much for joining in onto Dev Talks.
Jai Hind to all your viewers. It's pleasure joining you. I have heard many of your videos and very, very interesting discussions. And congratulate that you are, doing such a great work for many of the Indians to understand what is happening on China. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That's really an honor hearing those words, ma'am. Just I before we begin the talk, why don't you tell us how are you going to help us understand China a little better? What is the premise of the discussion that we are, wanting to have, and the talk that you're wanting to give? Uh, how would you like to structure it right in the beginning?
Yeah, so basically, what I want to do is let your viewers understand from a historical perspective how there has been a continuity in China. I mean, most of the discussions that we have is either talking about Xi Jinping and how the policies are, what is India-China relations from a very very narrow perspective of how things are evolving now. So what I'm going to tell you is from the perspective of China, where there is a continuity from historical times to the establishment of PRC and the evolution to Mao from Xi Jinping, four generation leaders. Because there is also something about a political continuity, there is an ideological continuity, and there is a philosophical continuity. So Chinese actually look back at their history to bring back the notions. There has been stall in terms of the Confucian thinking in China, but now again it is a revival. So in one sense, they look back at their own history to make policies, to draft their visions, and then build up on that. So basically, they're trying to tell everyone that China is a great civilization and it's a rich civilization, and you need to look at China from that perspective. And there are all philosophical, not literally religious, but theological, things which are there in their history, and that is what China denotes. So we need to look at China from that perspective. So what I'm going to do is also many of the issues that are very contemporary issues when we talk about China Dream, BRI, and all of that. So I'm going to tell how that is linked to their history, what is happening now, and how there is a continuity in the policies from Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping now. So that evolution. So I would want your people to understand that.
Ma'am, Xi Jinping refers to this very often, the China dream, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's something that they've spoken about multiple times. These are nice philosophical phrases. What do they actually mean?
Okay, so when you're talking about China Dream, the Chinese nation, all these notions, okay, as I said, these are all from coming back from their history. These are very continuous political rhetorics which have been there in the past times, and it has evolved over a period of time. Okay, so Xi Jinping hasn't come out suddenly with this China Dream or Chinese nation sort of thing. But let me just tell you from the back. Okay, so when we talk about Chinese nation as the term, it really evolved in 1902. Okay, that's the early 20th century, which whereby the first use of it was by Liang Qichao, uh, and in his article called General Development Trends of Academic Ideology in China. And later in 1905, he again used this term, the Chinese nation, more than almost 7 times in his articles. Okay, and what he referred to was the Han nationality. I mean, when we talk about China is not one nationality. Okay, we need to understand that. So there are other 55 nationalities which most of you really don't talk about. We just talk about China as Chinese, one homogeneous entity. It is not so. So well he was referring to only Han nationality, which is considered to be a very superior elitist kind of nationality, as the main nationality and the inheritor of what the Chinese called as Yan Huang, Okay, Yan Huang basically is the descendants of the fiery emperor and yellow emperor. So basically, they call that most of we talk about China as the descendants of yellow emperor, the yellow race and everything that we talk, right? So basically, they call about the yellow emperor descendants. That is what they call it as Yan Huang Tsun. Okay, uh, and hence when Liang Qichao was actually defining this notion of China, he was simply being, talking about being an old civilization to a modern territorial nation state. Okay, that was the difference that he was talking about. Now, when he talked about this term with Chinese nation, which Chinese proudly talk about as Zhonghua Minzu, our great civilizations, great nation, and all of that. It was later that Zhou Rong, a revolutionary of the anti-Qing and anti-Manchu, had linked the Han race, that is the Han nationality, to the Chinese nation. Okay, and in his book, The Revolutionary Army, published something around in 1903, he divided the entire yellow race into two subcategories. Okay, one was the Siberian race, and the other was the Chinese race. This is something which is very interesting to know for all of your viewers. While the Siberian race actually included the Mongols, the Manchus, the Turks, the Hungarians, and other people in Europe, the Chinese race was further divided into two subcategories. One was the Chinese, especially referring to the Han race, and those who were Koreans, Tibetans, and other East Asians. Okay, so there were these two subcategories with the Chinese race that we talk about. In that sense, what Sorong was trying to do only looked at the Han race as the representing the entire Chinese nation, okay, not the other nationalities. And the term Chinese nation that denoted the racial kinship based on Chinese and their ties to the land. So this was one very distinctive feature of what the Chinese nation evolved. Then later, when we come back to Chang Pin Ling and others, the philosophical philosophers and others, they use a correlation to Han nationality with the Chinese nation. And in his argument in 1907, he explained the term, and this is very technical for some of your viewers. He explained the term in Hua, Xia, and Han. Okay, whereby Hua actually denoted as land. When we call about Zhonghua, that is Chinese nation, Hua is also this Zhonghua. Okay, so they had Hua, Xia, and Han. Okay, three of them. And Hua actually he defined Hua as land, with Xia and Han denoting the race. Okay, so Han and Xia, your viewers can understand that. And then he pointed out, as per the Chinese dictionary, the people of the Middle Kingdom, the China is also called as the Middle Kingdom, okay, they were known as Xia people. Okay, and by correlating this term Xia and Han, he justified his argument that the Han nationality was equivalent to the Chinese nation. So again, you see that everything was a superiority of the Han nationality. Okay, none of the others that I just mentioned about the Tibetans, the Mongols, the Manchus, and all of that were not a part of this Chinese nation notion in the earlier 20th century. Okay, during that discussion. But that is not the case over the period, and I will explain you that. Okay, Yang Tu, who was a political reformer, he wrote an article called "Theory of Gold and Iron Doctrine," which was published in 1907, and he stated that the Chinese nation was not related to one ethnic nationality. Okay, that is the Han nationality, but was a geographic and cultural concept. And he stated that the monarch was an agent of the nation and a representation of all people, thereby referring to the distinction between the Manchus and the Han Chinese. So we are having these distinctions off and on coming in the history of China, where what does China represent? Okay, and I'm looking at this history because we are talking about China dream. It's not similar to American dreams, which people blindly relate to it. Okay, so when we talk about it coming to 1912, the term actually used by the president of the new republic, that is Yuan Shikai, which was later expanded by Sun Yat-sen. We all know about the new republic that was formed. Sun Yat-sen, we all know, is the father of the modern China. He represented the term to include the Han, that is the red. They consider Han nationality as the red. Included the Manchus, which were the yellow. Then he included the Mongolians, that was the blue. And then he included the Hui nationality, which is the Xinjiang, this thing, which were considered the white, and the Tibetans, that's the black. Okay, so he incorporated all of these five nationalities into one notion. Okay, and it was the concept that came out was the Republic of Five Nationalities, and he clearly mentioned that it was the Republic of Five Nationalities, not the 55, 56 that we talk about right now. Okay, and you know, see the so the historically the Chinese have a very strong concept of what is insider and what is outsider. Okay, so insider is basically the Han nationality. All the others are considered to be the outsiders, not the Chinese nation. This was very strong concept from the historical perspective to now. So those under the domain of the central state territories were distinguished from those who were outside. So apart from the civilized people being the Han nationalities, okay, such as the Shia within the territories, the peripheral communities which we are talking about, okay, they were all viewed as barbarians. So there was very distinct difference between who were the supreme nationality, the elitist ones, who were the civilized nationalities, which were the Shia and Han. Others were all barbarians, and their barbarians were also in the terms like they called it as E, which is in the Tongi in the east. They called it as Rong or Shirong in the west. Then they called Ti, that is Peti in the north, and then the Man, that is the Nanman in the south. So basically, the barbarians were these nationalities like the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Manchus, the Mongols, all of these. These were the barbarians. Okay. Hence, the five nationalities that incorporated the concept of Republic of Five Nationalities was an inclusion of barbarians in the Chinese state. Okay. While the exclusion from the majority and dominating nationality continued. Okay. So the term is very different from Hua, Xia, and Han people who were the descendants of the Yellow Emperor that we were talking about. Now, by the 1980s, and I'm jumping a lot, okay? I'm not just giving you every line of it, but 1980s is where the reforms came into China. Deng Xiaoping's time I'm talking about. Everything changed during that time. The Hua people was the representative term. However, Qin Yongqi argued that the Chinese nation formed over a long historical period now represents all the people of various ethnic groups in China and even the overseas Chinese diaspora who identify with the Chinese nation. Now, this is very interesting because 1980s is where the reforms are opening. They are opening up their doors to the outside world. They are connecting with other, countries, and especially the Singapore, the Malaysians, where the ethnic nationalities of Chinese descendants were there. They all came under this whole term of Chinese nation. Okay, they started to link with them. And when we want to understand the Southeast Asia and China relation, this is very significant. Okay, so alongside another term reappeared in China that is called the Greater China. Okay, this is in the 80s, but it appeared basically in the late 70s actually. The term, the Great China appeared with a different definition to promote economic linkages with Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, and the Chinese, mainland. That is the main China that we talk about. So thereafter, the emphasis was put on creating a Chinese community with international linkages as a unified group. So now Chinese nation does not represent only the Han, that is the superiority. It not only included the barbarians, that is the other nationalities in the periphery, but it also included the extended nationalities, ethnic nationalities, which were in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, everything. And subsequently, the underlying factors of Chinese nation were envisaged to assimilate all nationalities into the concept of Greater China, with ethnic and racial affiliations becoming transnational. Okay. Now, this incorporated the seeds of nationalism, which we talk about. Chinese nationalism is on the rise, which were visible in 1996 publication, where China started to say, there was a very interesting book that came out at that point of time where it was China Can Say No. This was one of the very remarkable books. And then in 2009, again, another publication came out from China, which was called as the Unhappy China. Now, these two international publications evoked this sense of nationalism in China, okay, among the ethnic Chinese. Now, ethnic Chinese, as I'm telling you, it incorporated all inside and outside. So this distinction was China was trying to blur this distinction. The authors of these books were actually questioning the power of China and called upon countering the West while emphasizing a national unity, which was transnational. And the books actually stressed on the proposition that the West has been pursuing a policy of containment towards China, and China should be ready to counter such, tendencies which are coming from the outside. This culminated into a very greater emphasis on issues of Chinese nationalist sentiments, the nationalism that we talk about, and China's aspiration to become a hegemonic power, which is very crucial to understand what is China going to become as a hegemonic power. And there was a political rhetoric that simultaneously emerged, which we called as the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In 1997, this term, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it replaced into what we call as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So this whole China nation became a very grand entity rather than just one, territorial entity that we look as a nation state. Okay. Now coming to President Xi's time. Okay, and I'll just conclude in few minutes about that. He himself actually stressed on this China dream thing, which he coined in 2012, as we all know about it. But it was a desire to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that I just explained. Okay, and which he considers also as the founding purpose of the Communist Party. Okay. He set forth two grand economic objectives, and you can relate these grand economic objectives as to why I started from early 20th century. The great economic objectives are two sentinel goals, which many of you must have heard about it. He set forth these two grand objectives, that is the two sentinel goals. One was to build a moderately prosperous society with the goal of elimination of poverty by 2021, which actually did not happen, and which coincides with the 100 years of the foundation of the party. And second is to make China into a fully developed nation by 2049. Now, 2049 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. Okay, 1949 to 100 years to 2049. Now, these objectives also had resonance with the 16 Party Congress report ratified by Jiang Zemin in 2002, and later reaffirmed by Hu Jintao's report in 2007, 2012, and the objectives which she has outlined are specifically termed into two broad categories. One, he says by 2035, China will basically realize socialist modernization by narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor and improving the environment significantly. And second, that there will be a second stage from 2035 to 2050, where China will become a leading global power and attain common prosperity. So CCP is basically, relentlessly pursuing this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And rejuvenation encompasses prosperity, collective effort, socialism, national glory, which all comes into China Dream. So China Dream is not just about American Dream, a better life for the Chinese who are living in Chinese mainland. No, it is unifying all of these ethnic nationalities, which is national, that is beyond the Chinese territory. It is Taiwan included, Hong Kong, Macau, even the Singapore and Malaysian, and maybe some you are staying in, the US, right? All of those nationalities under one roof, and their common prosperity or common efforts to build up a very great nation that is called the Chinese nation. So it's that grand project. Okay.
One thing one must say about the Chinese is that the plans that they build are pretty interesting, and the kind of literature they write about those plans is
Yes.
even more interesting. Uh, Ma'am, you spoke about the periphery and you spoke about the concept of
Right.
barbarians. I want to,
Right.
ask you a little more about that. There's an interesting word I of course keep forgetting it, that they call the Russians, which
Right.
I believe literally translates into a old bearded man. Uh,
Hmm.
I'm not sure if that is the right thing or not, but what is this concept of barbarians and how is the periphery been defined?
Yeah, so I mean, periphery is also a very interesting term for the Chinese. There are many terminologies that they use interchangeably, and that is where the problem when India wants to deal with China comes up. When we want to talk about India-China relations, one of the things which is very crucial to understand is what is Chinese territory, how much is Chinese territory, and where is their periphery, coming to, and who are the part of that periphery. And it is always very confusing when you read the Chinese literature and in the Chinese text. Now, periphery, there are many terms, and just to tell for your viewers, I mean, those who know Chinese and who are listening to your this thing, they use the terms as Wai Wei, which is outer boundary. They use at Chou Wei, which is again surrounding. They use Chopian, which is surrounding border. They call it as the PNUan, which is fringe. They call it as PNGiang, which is frontier region. PNGA, which is borderline. So there are many terms of it. Okay, but more often than not, Chinese use the term PNGiang, that is the frontier region, to mean the periphery in very simple terms, which actually means the bordering region. So basically, it is not just periphery in the terms of one side, and that is also linked to what neighborhood philosophy or policies that they make, right? And if I decode this term as PN PN is both the meaning of frontier and far, and Chiang has the meaning of borderline and also governance of land by the state. So everything is encompassing. Hence, the notion of what periphery itself incorporates the idea that land, sea, and air as a total region of control or governance. Okay, this is China's understanding about what periphery is all about. So when we say that we have a policy, we think about, oh, we have to deal with China and the land policy. No, or we have to lead with the maritime. So these distinctions do not exist for the Chinese. For the Chinese, this is a one entity of periphery control. A control of both, of all the three, land, sea, and air, as a total control, and then the governance of all of that. However, this lucid understanding has allowed Chinese to have a diverse understanding which constitutes periphery over different periods of time. Okay, and so when they deal with the outsiders, like if they are dealing with issues of border problem with India, or maybe Bhutan or anybody, they really confuse you with all these. They really confuse you with all of these terminologies, right? So uh, in the if I look at the first understanding of periphery, and that's a historical thing again, it was during the Qing dynasty where China actually unified into one entity. That is something around 221 to 206 BCE. Okay, it was different from what we understand as a nation state today, and is based on recognition of nationalities for a unified state. Okay, and during the Wang period, that is 9 to 23 AD somewhere, the concept of nation state was formulated in China, and it laid down emphasis on governing the peripheries based on the policy of inter-ethnic ideology. Okay, so the fundamental governance strategy that was there at that point of time was to safeguard the center and govern the borders by segregating them into regions. Hence, the peripheral region were subdivided into, as I just talked about the barbarian thing. So it was again subdivided into four major classifications. One was the northern barbarian, the other was the southern barbarian. Then there was a Tibetan, the eastern barbarian. And I'll just give you an example of southern barbarian included the Tibetan Burma group. Okay. Then there was a eastern barbarian, and then there was a western barbarian. So for them, these territories were, the peripheries were basically the territories which were where the barbarians were living, and these barbarians were to be controlled and governed by their, by their policy of governance. Okay, but in the post reform period, that is after the 80s that I'm talking about, the overall policy for peripheral region was focused on the banner that we call it as the development of the western sector, which is more crucial for us to understand. And between, say, 2000 to 2002, the Chinese government has launched something around 36 key projects under this policy with a total investment of, say, 600 billion yuan. And as they are promoting this Western sector development, this is where they are also moving and stretching to controlling the borders, and stressing on how the governance of these borders need to be taken care of, along with the policies for the neighborhood countries, whether it is Nepal or the Russians on the other side, Indians at that point, Bhutan, all of that. Okay, that also comes. So when we talk about the Grand Eurasia project, that is a BRI project, it all comes under this Western sector development policy. So basically, China has three-pronged strategy for the peripheral region. One is that development. Development is basically about opening up infrastructure development, ecological protection, all these which we are talking about under the BRI. The second thing is about the stability, that is the inter-ethnic relations, religious problems, and divisions of interest, which comes for when we talk about Tibetan issue, when we talk about Xinjiang issue, there are problems about inter-ethnic, clashes. Even in Mongolia, there are, right? All of that. And the third factor that is important is the security, that is the border social management, like the trans-border mobility issues. Like for example, if you go into Tibet and Nepal, there has been a mobility where people used to go freely from Nepal to Tibet. There were not those posts, but now if you see, there are checkposts. Okay, so for the security, what they have done is they have made rigid borders which are controlled, and their posts are there which will keep a check on who is moving in and out. And the security also included, of course, other things like the drug peddling, the diseases, the AIDS, other border management and construction thing. So basically these are the three broad issues that incorporate. Now with regard to the periphery, one of the things which is very important is the neighborhood. Okay, China has all along adhered to a policy of what they call it as chin or to chin. Basically, towards neighboring countries, it's called as you are close, but you are near, but not close. Okay, what it means is that you know a, it will say that we have a policy about win-win situation in ties. Okay, so its neighborhood policy will, but it will compartmentalize between friends and distant neighbors, which is where when we talk about neighborhood policy in terms of Pakistan and India, the difference lies. Okay, one of the interesting things which I kept on telling my students is that when we talk about China Pakistan relation, we say all weather friendship, but in Chinese we call as yo yi is a friendship. Okay, but when the Chinese talk about China India relations, they only use the term as yo how, which is good friendly, good neighborly relation. So it's not friends. Okay, there is where the distinction begins for the Chinese in terms of neighborhood. Okay, now in terms of how the policies have been compartmentalized, we can look at Hu Zhiyong, who was a senior fellow at the Institute of International Relations, as well as the vice director and secretary general of China's Central Asia South Asia Forum. He stated that China, and I'm quoting that, China does not give any significant importance to India. Okay, its economic interests push China to look at India, while in terms of economic progress, India is regarded as an unworthy nation fraught with its own economic and political problems. Unquote. So this is very crucial for any India to understand how the Chinese started to look at India. Why we have a problem today. When we say that, okay, we had the 2020 Galwan issue, why we had that start from here. It germinates from here. Okay. Now, although what has changed now is over the years, India-US closeness, we all know, especially the civil nuclear deal, and the new formulations that have come up, like the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, that has made China, uneasy over the changing neighborhood environment. Yet China has not begun to place India at par with other major powers and give its due position. And this is where very crucial for anybody who wants to understand about how China looks at India, and especially when we talk about the Galwan incident. Things have changed to a certain extent now, and China looks at India as the South Asian power and realize that its position in South Asia. And I was just listening to Jaidev Ranade's discussion the other day that you had in your channel, and I was completely agreeing to what he's saying, that why China has changed now, after the Galwan. It has started to realize that India is a power. You may not consider it as one of the major powers to be dealing with, but it is a power in South Asia, and is not a small power. Uh, it's a larger, greater objective that it wants to look at. So China's approach to India is underpinned with basically three aspects I would consider. One is the internal stability, basically, which is threatened by the Tibetan movements, and maybe even at times with the Xinjiang Uyghur problems and other minority issues. Okay, the second issue is the economic sustainability issue, as it is export oriented economy needs large markets, and after the exports have gone down in US and EU, which has declined, of course it looks at India as a major market. Okay, so that is the issue. And after the pandemics, of course, the economic engagement has become as an urgency for the Chinese to look at India. And the third factor is the peaceful surrounding environment, by way of which it wants to become a big brother in the region. and oft repeated the debt burden or the threat perceptions which India raises, or the small nations are really worried about. The Vietnamese are worried, Nepal is worried. So all that threat perceptions cool down because it creates a good environment with a great power which is next door, India. So that's the whole neighborhood approach that Chinese have.
Doesn't fail to amaze someone that they've actually charted out this entire thing. And yeah, I mean, I personally feel with the current statements which are coming out of China that there is indeed a recognition of India which has probably been brought up to them, which
Hmm.
probably they didn't want to accept, but currently they have to.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
that
It's like forced upon them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Ma'am, now the next question I have for you is that uh, the policy of Deng, which was hide your strength, bide your time, wait and watch, around say, it was always
Hmm.
a
Keeping a
it has
low profile. Yeah.
and the best thing was it wasn't that they were not doing aggressive steps.
Hmm.
They were the BRI did not get its name, but the BRI was on.
Hmm.
Ujintao had done it, and the Gwadar project and all these things, Haman Tota and all these guys, these things were already at work.
Hmm.
A lot of people tend to believe that Xi Jinping basically spoiled that plan
Hmm.
by, I mean, running fast or however you want to put it across. Now, how does that play into the entire narrative of China, which is now in a place where they're going completely opposite than from the what the leadership had told them to do? How does it
Yeah,
fit
I
there?
mean, it's not that the leadership has told them to do something different. And, I mean, let me just talk about how Deng Xiaoping really looked at this low profile thing. Yeah, there is a debate within China itself. Most of the understanding that we have about keeping a low profile is a Western, scholarship that comes to us. And that is how they have translated for us. But whether Chinese actually thought about keeping a low profile, that's the issue. Because internally, China has a debate about what this means. They never talked about keeping a low profile. They never talked about, biding the time and hiding your capabilities and then you attack. Okay. In that debate, if I go by what Deng Xiaoping stated, and there was a 24 character strategy that he put out, it said about observe calmly, secure position, cope with affairs calmly, hide from light and nourish obscurity. Okay, hide from light and nourish obscurity. Okay, not hide your time and bide your this thing. Maintain low profile and never claim leadership position. This is what Deng Xiaoping was telling at that point of time. And later he added, something called as making contributions to it. Now, this 24 character, terminology was decoded by the former PRC general, whose name was Xiong Guang Kai. And he published an article talking about public diplomacy in Public Diplomacy Quarterly, and argued that the translation of, as hide our capacities and bide our time, or hide our capability and bide your time, was grossly wrong. And this is the PRC general talking about it. And he said that it was manipulated by the West. What Deng Xiaoping never mentioned about the time factor into it. Okay. And later he suggested that, the translation should be hide from light and nourish obscurity. That means, in fact, the literal translation of this 24 character also reflected that Tang was emphasizing on building capabilities with a calm posture rather than becoming arrogant to claim global positions. Probably that has changed now. Okay. The phrase that, hide from light and nourish obscurity uh, and make contributions became the core of Chinese foreign policy at that point of time. And the Western scholarship has, however, looked at Deng Xiaoping having a diplomatic strategy of keeping a low profile and, waiting for an opportune time to show their capabilities. It was never there. They always wanted to, not show their what they plan to do. So it was like, we call it as hiding the dragon, knife, and then attacking suddenly, like the guerrilla attacks that we have, right? So this is always a Chinese strategy. Now, during the 16th Party Congress in 2012, under the the earlier president Hu Jintao, He formulated China's foreign policy into three pillars: vis-a-vis relations with major powers, with neighboring states, and developing countries. Okay, so there were these three-pronged, strategy. And then he, by the 17th Party Congress, he included in 2007, he expanded these three pillars to five pillars and included multilateralism and soft power into it. Now, what Xi Jinping is doing in the 18th Party Congress in 2012 is that he reiterated these five pillars, okay, along with directing the armed forces to play a bigger role to commensurate to the international standing of China. So the PLA's role has become more significant under Xi Jinping, which is where the aggressive approach has come into play. The posture that we talk about Xi Jinping. So it's basically just addition onto what was there. You know, and then in 2013, Xi Jinping again proposed a shift to its diplomatic strategy from hide one capabilities and bide one time, that we say, to striving for achievement. Okay, which is a more proactive engagement strategy, basically on attacking and being more active, or taking greater initiative and literally actively going out, barging onto the world and trying to force claim your position, something like that. Okay. And what Xi Jinping did was he made a reference to a new type of international relations and a new model of major country relations, which actually gained prominence under his leadership. And in these five pillars and other articulations of major power relations, China has been reluctant to include India in the category of a new type of major power relations, as I just mentioned. Okay. Um, and this new type of major power relations was actually coined by the former foreign minister Yang Jiechi. Now you can understand how things have evolved into India China relations. Now under President Xi, what has happened, he has visioned a world led by major powers, excluding the pertinent role of India, of course. And he has, as the change happened in the global environment, that is what is happening in US, EU, and all of that. Some scholars have also started to talk about the concept of two superpowers and multiple powers. People call this Liang Qiao To Qiang. Okay, so basically, he's looking at the G2 grouping to reflect the global change that is happening with the rapid rise of China as the second largest economic structure in the world. So it will be just US and China, the bipolar world. Okay, and if you see most of the scholars of international relations, like Professor Yan Shuitong and all of that, they have been constantly talking about these two powers to be there, US and China, as the leading powers of the global structure. And they view that that other nations are not capable enough to challenge any of these changes. So the future world is going to be between US and China. Okay. And in 2017, Xi Jinping endorsed these ideas at the speech of the National Security Seminar in Beijing, and he indicated that China should take the task to guide the international community. So his approach is basically interpreted as the world actually needs these two guides. Okay, two guides means the US and China, to create a new world order and to safeguard international security, referring to the joint responsibility of US and China. So as a strong opponent of protectionism, she is advocating that he wants a greater global and regional economic integration. Even if multilateral diplomacy calls are made, China is concerned about the reform of international system and the international structure of global governance, whereby China would be in a leading global player, and their target was, for 2020, was to make significant progress in information technology and strategic capability, and by 2035, modernizing their national defense and military, and by 2050, they would actually become a world-class Chinese military. And now Xi Jinping has been calling about fighting the wars to win, basically implying that China will assess the comprehensibility of the opponent before engaging in wars and only to reap long-term objectives. Now, in that notion, I think India has really, sent ripples to China. That is what I can say. It is where that whole structure is being, you know, uh, I would say it's like an earth-shaking changes are being made. That is what the whole change is all about from the Chinese perspective. Yeah.
That's interesting. That tells you that China will need to factor in India into its future prospects,
Yes.
which sadly it didn't do before.
Yes.
Uh,
Ye-
Sadly, happily, either ways, depending on the
Though I've
perspective
not
that
talked about a lot of BRI thing into it, which you were mentioning, maybe we can
let's do that,
just
man.
further talk.
Let's talk about the BRI, and of course, uh, there are two, three thought processes. If I just take a minute, if you don't mind, one
Yeah.
thought process says that the Chinese had a lot of extra production capacity of infrastructure, and they just
Right.
wanted to basically export that, and without which their industry would have fallen. So they decided to just push it out there. The second thought process talks about the factor that the Chinese would have had to uh, consider basically setting up a whole strategic sector for their future trade.
Mm,
A lot of it is to do with trade with Europe uh,
mm.
and Russia, as a matter of fact, going through Central Asia and everything like that. So they're basically securing this thing. How much of each one of these narratives makes sense? How much of it is military, and what is the game going on with regards to BRI now?
So as I just mentioned, China has a continuity of every thought process. Okay. And BRI is also not something which suddenly came up with Xi Jinping thing. Maybe Xi Jinping has encompassed all the projects under one banner, which is called as it started with an one belt, one road, banner, and then changed into a belt and road initiative sort of thing. So basically, Xi Jinping has just encompassed all of these projects into that banner. So it's like package deal sort of thing. But and you are right that there are these focus about the current issues that China is facing internally in terms of the export oriented economy, that they have to export their goods, and there is a decline in the Europe, so looking for other markets, whether in Africa or India and all of that. All of these factors are there. Security, of course, is. But as I said, this is also about the Chinese nation. Let's just understand a little bit of what that is all about. See, China is actually advocating the new type of globalization, as just mentioned. And this new type of globalization actually refers to globalization process of openness, tolerance, inclusiveness, and sharing. Now, under that principle of equality, pursuit of win-win, which they call it as, and the principles to discuss about, build, and share together. What is important is the node areas along the Belt and Road. Basically, China will focus on Central Asia, it will focus on South Asia, West Asia, Southeast Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, and feels directly constrained, affected by the relationship between China and US, China and Russia, China and Europe to varying degrees, right? But under that, what China is looking into BRI is not just about exports and military. There are multiple issues. The first thing is the governance issue. Okay. In terms of the governance issue, China in the past has been looking at global governance issue, because China now wants to, as I said, wants to be the player as the global, you know, uh, ruler, or the supreme power in the world. So Xi Jinping has clearly articulated that major power relations is significant, and he's looking at the US and China as two major powers. And Shi Jinping and Kochhar, they look at the global governance issues from four different deficits. They looked at, China, the world is now facing, four kinds of deficit. One is the governance deficit, then there is a trust deficit, then there is a peace deficit, there's a development deficit, and there is, the imbalance in North and South and all of that. So these four deficits have created a perspective that China is in the perception of ability to provide public goods for global governance through the BRI participation. Okay. But it also means that China has a status in the international community, has grown as a beneficiary of the world development, to a promoter of world development. Okay, so this is the governance issue that it is looking at. That's the one issue. The second issue under the BRI is about linking with the existing international institutions. Okay, that is also one of the factors under BRI, where it is focusing on achieving strategic integration with the existing international organizations, development plans, and giving play to complementary advantages. That is, by November 2019, if you see, China has already signed almost 30 international organizations for its BRI projects, and has written into the UN General Assembly resolution, and the spirit of BRI for cooperation has become very vertical for the global governance. The third issue is the digital Silk Road that it is talking about. Okay, that is also one of the factors in the BRI. And it is talking about advantage of the global changes. It is talking about promoting a digital Silk Route for the fourth industrial revolution that will happen. We talk about the 5G, the Huawei, all of that you must have heard about in news. It all is encompassing under the digital Silk Route. And there is other factors which are included into it is the big data, the artificial intelligence, the outer space, right? All these technologies would be a part of this digital Silk Route. And it wants to connect to the landlocked countries and the maritime countries through internet and related technologies, and connecting with the small countries and the big markets to achieve coordinated economic and social progress. So this is the third thing. The fourth factor under the BRI is the third country cooperation. Okay, under that, China is looking for third country cooperation to avoid competition. It specifically deals with investments in foreign countries where there is unnecessary competition. Say, for example, in the neighborhood in South Asia and all of that, and to avoid competition and create coordination with the third world countries. The fifth factor it is looking at is the internationalization of the Chinese currency, that is renminbi, right? Now, internationalization of the currency is also very important for them because it has established the RMB clearing system and national currency listed under the trading system. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, that is a BRI project, it wants to make efforts to promote trade liberalization from both its own and international perspective. And on the international forum, it wants 83 countries and international organizations which has participated in the BRI and has promoted the development of trade integration and facilitation. So China basically perceives, under when it wants to achieve these things under the BRI, there would be, say, four challenges or possibilities that may happen in the whole world. The first possibility is that the whole world will have a jungle war, something like we already have a Russian, Ukraine war. So there would be a chaos in the whole world. Everyone would be fighting. Maybe India, China will fight. Maybe India, Pakistan will fight. Maybe China will fight with the Philippines and the Korea and Japan or whatever. So there would be like a jungle war. This is the first perception that they have. Second is that it may be an international multilateral system is accelerating the process of disintegration and uh, reconstruction, and the strengthening of regional economic integration and cooperation mechanism, and many become an important alternative to multilateralization and globalization. The third possibility it looks at is that there would be a parallel system which would be rising. So it would face a challenge from that. And lastly, it is looking at globalization will further consolidate and the concept of community of shared future for mankind will become popular, which it is advocating, right? In terms of South Asia, and I'm looking at India also, China is already establishing party-to-party ties. It has established in Nepal, the Communist Party exchanges. During the former Prime Minister Oli's time, we have heard many news about, party-to-party exchanges. And the unified communists were having exchanges. It has done with other countries also. It is doing with Laos now, Cambodia. There are challenges if you look at that. And then under the BRI umbrella, it wants to create a community of common destiny. So China will advance its notion of strategic and military alliance relationship with some of the countries that you just mentioned about the military aspect. Okay. Now here you would see that China has advocated a success model of political system, which is basically the socialism with Chinese characters. This is the success model, and there have been a lot of literature on that. And so China believes that it can give a new choice to other nations. Which is what is given to Nepal, right? We have a next door, example of how things changed. And it wants to seek to grow economically while maintaining their influence. So what it says is China is eager to assist these small neighboring powers to engage in greater economic cooperation with China to reap the benefits of growth. And if you see the discussions that happened with China, Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the four, quadrilateral, talks, this is where you can really place the military alliance aspect into it. Okay, it's not just about the party-party relation or the economic relations. The military alliance relation is also linked to it. So China will create a sphere of regional dominance that will guide the prosperity of other nations. And the rhetoric is that China has been creating a community of common destiny. Now, what is this common destiny or common prosperity of Asian nations? It has, Xi Jinping is advocating that Asian nations with the governance of Asians, of course, under the leadership of China or under the leadership of President Xi Jinping if he continues for all his time. So these are the historical, but one of the historical fact which I think your viewers would need to understand is that this whole Silk Route was never a name by the Chinese or with the China, right? We all have known about that. The Silk Route was neither built or promoted by the Chinese. In the ancient text, if you see, the Silk Road name was around, say, 1860 or maybe 1877, actually. The German geographer and scientist, Baron Ferdinand Frere or uh, Richthofen, better known as, Richthofen, he promoted the concept of Silk, which actually combined the inspection situation and comparing it with the history. He proposed Silk Road existed around, say, second century BC. Okay. Uh, but there is this propaganda that, by the Chinese under the Silk Road BRI. If you see on their pages, you will understand that. Okay, so what is BRI? It's an umbrella thing which has come from Chang Qian's voyage, or the route Chang Qian took to the Western region, and the Silk Route came out. So there is this narrative floated by the Chinese, and so he found the West Route. But as per the archaeological excavations, if you see, uh, it all dated back to Shang Dynasty, around 16th to 11th BC, and there was already a transportation route from Xinjiang to China. That is the mainland China that we are talking about. And Changqing's access to the Western region was also not for trade. At that time, in order to defeat the Huns, the Emperor Han Wu, that is Emperor of the China, he had sent Changqian to contact with the greater Kushanas, that is basically the Tayuecher they call it as, in the area of present day Afghanistan. So basically that was the purpose at that point of time. And if I can just explain in 2 minutes about what that was. If you see the Kushan Empire, which is the Kanishka, right? It was a great pattern of Buddhism, right? He played an important role in spreading Buddhism to Central Asia and China. And the Kushan Empire in the first century spread to encompass much of Afghanistan and then northern parts of Indian subcontinent, at least as far as the Saketa and Sarnath, that is near the Varanasi. Okay, and this Yuechur were basically the nomadic pastoralists, basically like the Charvaha, what we call it in India, and they had a major defeat by the Xiongnu in 176 BC. And that time, the UH actually split into two groups, basically into different directions. That is the greater UH, that is the Huns that we are talking about, and the lesser UH. Okay, so Changqing was basically sent as an envoy for the, again for the second time, by organizing a mission troop carrying large bulk of silk, gold, crafts, treasures, everything as rewards for the small countries along the way, and in order to consolidate the influence of the Han dynasty into small countries and expanding the influence of silk in the Central Asia. The same thing happens in the when we talk about the maritime route. The whole ship that came was basically for taking all these small goods and things to appease the neighbors, the small countries, and if they agree, then they unite under the leadership of the emperors, or basically accept the suzerainty kind of a concept. And if they don't, then the wars happen, because the ships were carrying all these military equipments and military things. So all of this has a military angle. It cannot be denied at any point of time. But the Chinese policy has been that first appease the nation, the opponent, give them gifts, give them a lot of gifts and other things, goods and everything. And when they agree to subjugate themselves, or to be, as Jaidev Ranaji was also saying, India should accept their, uh, superiority, and then accept to be under them, then that's fine. But if that doesn't happen, then wars broke out. Then there is clash. Yeah.
My way or the highway.
Yes, my way or the height. So this has been the history of BRI from past to present, and these umbrella projects are actually united. I mean, Ujinda also came out with these projects, small little. So, as I told you about the Western sector development, 36 key projects were there. All this has now come under the BRI. It's one banner for all of these projects. There was always already a Yunnan to Myanmar, all these linkages that were being promoted by the Chinese. Now this has come under the BRI.
Yeah. Ma'am, lastly, just to finish this wonderful talk, I want to know the mandate from heaven. Who in heaven gave the mandate to China?
Yeah. So mandate to heaven again is a very debatable topic within China. Also, there's a lot of discussion that is happening, and it's just not about mandate of heaven in China, but there's also about U.S. hegemony. Okay. Now, basically, when we talk about U.S. hegemonic role, when the Chinese are actually debating within China about the U.S. hegemonic role, they maintain that it will not become a hegemonic power like the US. Okay? So they are advocating that China will not be a hegemonic power. So what kind of a power China will be is very interesting for us to understand. And the argument to convince is that China has suffered foreign aggression and humiliation at the hands of the Western powers during the Opium War of 1840. So if you would have heard our foreign minister, external affairs minister, Dr. S. Jaishankarji talking about, China is talking about 100 years of humiliation. It's all that. China has been talking about 100 years of humiliation. It's talking about, Chinese have had the worst of times by the foreign aggressors. It has been, controlled and, literally destroyed by the foreign aggressors. So China is not going to become a hegemonic power. Now we all know what power is all about. Uh, we know how power works, right? But the Chinese scholars and official discourse use the term hegemony in a very derogatory manner with a very strong criticism. So US is a hegemon, okay, and it's really destroyed all countries, and we are not going to become that hegemon. We are going to be the good power, and what kind of power is very interesting. Okay, so the US and other major powers considered by China as EU, that is European Union, Russia, Japan, and now even India in that order. You know, so there is a serious debate about how that will provide China will, what China will provide to the world. If it will not become a hegemonic power, what will China be? What will China give to the world? Okay, and whereby Chinese make a distinction between hegemony and hegemonism. Okay, and the centrality of the argument is over the governance of the international society. So the traditional philosophy of China made a distinction between rule by force and rule by virtue. Okay, rule by force was Patao, and rule by virtue was Bangtao. Now, somewhere you would find a correlation of this Wangtao in what we have in Indian civilization as Ram Rajya. Okay, and when I explain to you what Wangtao is, the rule by virtue is all about, you will understand how Professor Yan is promoting that and how the Chinese are promoting that concept. Okay, as far as the Chinese, a hegemonic rule by virtue can be pursued. Okay, so Professor Yan Shuitong, in his book, which is a very wonderful book now and hotly debated among the Western scholarship, is the leadership and the rise of great powers. So he highlighted the need for China to adopt to rule by virtue. That is the Bangta. And the term rule by virtue is somewhat similar to even John Eckenberry's concept, John Eckenberry's concept of benign hegemony. Okay, something like that. As I said, something like I have done a article about Akhand Bharat and Ram Rajya and this whole notion about the rule by virtue thing. So Professor Yan actually talks about the old Chinese models of to rule, where a ruler is to rule with benevolence and need to appease people with virtue. You know, so while advocating to establish a rule by virtue, he's rather than a hegemonic rule, he says that we need to establish a strong moral charisma of Chinese diplomacy while abandoning the Tang's policy of non-alignment. So in 2013, he was under. He says that President Xi Jinping has put forth the shift in China's approach of striving in achievement from that we were talking about hide from light and bide your time sort of thing. So the essence of the strategy is to establish relations with neighboring countries on the principle of proximity, sincerity, benevolent, and all of that. And his rule by virtue strategy is basically that he proposes to establish something like fairness, justice, build on civilizational connections, all of that, and build China should build military alliances in the region rather than just an economic economic aid provider. This is the core concept of. So it is not exactly the Ram Raj. right? Which we understand in India, because rule by virtue for us is Ram Rajya, where we are not talking about military alliances. Okay. Now, alongside, in China, there is this debate about over the possibility of creating a Chinese Renaissance. That is the Chinese nation thing which we are talking about. Okay, depending on the traditional Chinese philosophy and the experience of the imperial rule in China. This is where the term what we call mandate of the heaven or the Tianxia system is significant. Okay, in 2005, Chao Ting Yang, the very famous author of this book called The Tianxia System, A Philosophical Introduction to the World System, he talked about this Tianxia thing, that mandate of the heaven. And he translated, all under the heaven, and in fact refers to Chinese notions of universalism. So for them, Tianxia or mandate of heaven is what the West call it as, notion of universalism. So there are these correlations. Okay. And for them, the idea has a geographical component and imagining a world of concentric circles with China as the center. So everyone would be around that. But the force of the idea is above all morals. So China will be the one which will be telling others how to do what to do, sort of thing. Okay. And Zhao Yang actually, published a few books later also on Tianxia system and discussed about China's worldview and said why we should not discuss about China's worldview. That is significant because that again comes to the historical aspect of mandate of the heaven. So if you see how Chao explained, he said that, the world remains a non-world, by which he meant that although there is globalization has already linked the world together, the present integration of the world is merely a geographical level and has little political meaning. So what you want to do with that is, he says that in his view, the China's traditional Tianxia or the mandate, I'm just using the word as Tianxia, basically the mandate of heaven, is the idea at least at three levels of meaning, that is geographical, psychological, and theoretical or political, right? So contrary to the state-centric approaches, he states that the world needs a commonly agreed upon world institution as its control center. Okay, whereby the power center is not democratically elected, but is legitimatized through its compliance with moral and ethical values. This is very significant for everyone to understand what this means. So it's basically overarching stress on moral and ethical values to lead the world into a not accepted, even within China. So this is the concept where all the debates come. And when we go into, how Liang Zhiping, another scholar, has talked about this, he's talked about the concept of Tianxia and the role the Xi Jinping and the CCP is creating in terms of incorporating the Chinese civilization into a new ideology. In the past, Tianxia was part of a moral civilization, like an order which is a moral civilizational order with universal meaning. Within this model civilizational order, the heaven gave birth to the people. The emperor received the mandate of the heaven, and respect for virtue sustained the people, and moral teachings were propagated near and far. So both within and China, outside the China, a kingdom was created where everyone would follow that thing. So he strongly criticized the notion that Chinese traditional Tianxia system made a distinction between Chinese and Barbarians, and he said that we abandoned that. We want to achieve a system where you know everything which is central to China would be dictated by one central authority, of course, Xi Jinping, who would be governing and telling everyone how the world institutions should work, and everyone around him, the circles, would have a moral obligation to accept and listen to what the mandate is given. So Tianxia, basically Tian is, it's basically, the heaven. Between that is the emperor, and the emperor listens to the god and gives the decisions to the people. So whatever the decision the emperor will give, the people will listen. Now here the people in the larger context of the mandate and heaven has changed to other countries, all the nations around it. So if China becomes the super leader, whether it is in the region, maybe a supreme leader in the region, not even in the global world, it would be dictating what needs to be done because it has the what we call the mandate of the what the gods want us to do. sort of thing. So that kind of, you know, structure would be created. And as I mentioned, they have clearly mentioned in that it will not be a democratically elected. You know how President, China is functioning. So there would be nothing as a democratic opponent sort of thing, but a moral, responsibility on each to abide by that mission, to accept that whatever is being said. So our Ram Rajya concept is completely different. You know, what India is talking about as a civilizational state is it is talking about bringing up our own traditional values of Ram Rajya, where Ram was not a dictator by any sense. Ram was listening to the voices of the masses and, working for the benefit of the masses, where all the masses were happy in their own ways. They were happy living, not that they were forced to do or having a moral obligation to do. So there is where the distinction between how China will create. So this is the I should say institutional infrastructure, institutional governance structure that it will be created by China.
An eye opener, ma'am. Let me assure you this, that when you don't consider the history of a place and then suddenly start analyzing it, it'll be difficult for us to understand where people are talking about and what people are talking about. I hope this
Yes. So,
talk
so
helps.
hmm. So I do understand that it has become a little more, heavy on some people. But if you want to understand China, you cannot understand China isolate. I mean, in in boxes by looking at Xi Jinping, because what Xi Jinping is getting is also from their historical facts. It is
Yeah.
going back to its history and trying to create that Renaissance. That's more significant.
A lot of what China is doing today was written quite a long time ago, as I said in the
Right.
opening, and I think
Right.
your talk is actually proved that particular point very, very squarely. Ma'am, thank you so much. This was a eye opener, and I do hope that I'll be able to get you back to discuss a
Sure.
little more of the philosophy of China. I guess we need to get
Yes.
into the minds of the Chinese to understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. Uh,
How the
till,
Chinese people think.
absolutely. Till we do
Sure.
that, ma'am, thank you so much and Jai Hind.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. Jai Hind forever.